The decolonial theorist Aníbal Quijano coined the now indispensable term the coloniality of power, which describes contestations over sex, labor, collective authority, and subjectivity/intersubjectivity between colonizer and colonized. What makes such exercises of power specifically colonial lies in how they involve the power to create and reproduce hierarchies, to place others into hierarchies, the power to sit higher than others in those hierarchies, and the power to preserve your own advantage by preventing others in lower hierarchical positions from ascending over you. As Maria Lugones points out, the coloniality of power and the classificatory hierarchies were important to the project of colonization. Regarding one taxonomy and hierarchy, she writes, quote, "The invention of race is a pivotal turn as it replaces the temporary relations of superiority and inferiority established through domination," end quote, with a hierarchy of superiority and inferiority that can persist beyond the determination of winners and losers of the physical military struggle of conquest. Forms of taxonomic hierarchy specifically were necessary ideological inventions enabling colonizers to frame those temporary military relations of superiority and inferiority as actually rooted in biology, as natural, and thus as both divinely ordained and inevitable. Colonial hierarchy systems also included new systems of ableism that situated the colonized along a differentiating axis of capacity and debility. Today, I will explore what I've come to call the 18th century Indian death song trope and how it constructed indigenous American populations along an axis of capacity and debility for settler colonial gain. This will entail, to some measure, representing these deaths, so my aim is to interrogate a musical culture of the spectacleization of colonial violence, and hopefully thereby to decline at least the numbing that reproducing violent spectacle via its retelling can yield, as it indeed did for the death song trope's audiences. The indigenous American population collapses following colonization due to colonial warfare, disease pandemics, and colonial resource extraction labor entered European cultural consciousness across the Atlantic world. For instance, in 17th century England, playwright William Davenant and composer Matthew Locke's semi-opera The Cruelty of the Spaniards in Peru and Purcell's semi-opera version of John Dryden's The Indian Queen reflect this consciousness. In the 18th century, the ongoingness of indigenous population decimation eventually produced a mythotrope of the disappearance of the Indian. Among the most commercially successful single instantiations of this trope is Anne Home Hunter's The Death Song of the Cherokee Indian, an original air brought from America, which purports to record the defiant song or chant of the son of a likely apocryphal indigenous American chieftain by the name of Alknoomook after being captured and sentenced to a burning at the stake. Let's listen to one strophe. Hunter's air constructed a backhandedly reverential, romanticized spectacle of a fictional individual indigenous death out of the common understanding of the historical, population-level lethality of New World coloniality. Michael Pisani clarifies that this colonial misrepresentation misrepresents an actual indigenous practice. Quote, "Singing a song of defiance in the face of torture had also been noted earlier, particularly in Jesuit missionary Joseph-François Lafitteau's 1724 study of customs among the Iroquois," end quote. So Hunter's death song translated indigenous practices for European comprehension through an invented idiom, which gets intimated as being characteristic of actual New World societies. Its marked use of iambic Scottish snap rhythms as it tonicizes the dominant at "Begin ye tormentors" functioned as a rhythmic cipher for otherness in British musical idioms. The actual practices of death songs still acknowledged today among various tribal communities would have been and still remain opaque and recalcitrant to settler representation. On the internet Q&A site Quora.com, an individual identifying as Ojibwe writes in response to a question about death song practices, quote, "For my tribe, if you're in the heat of battle and you're not going to make it out alive, start singing. As for what and why, I'm not going to tell you," end quote. Hunter's death song had circulated anonymously in the late 18th century before she published it under her name in 1802. Its tune and text had already been incorporated into numerous contemporaneous works, but without her bass line. These include Anne Julia Hatton's now lost libretto for the extremely popular musical/opera The Songs of Tammany, or The Indian Chief, 1794, which is the first documented American libretto by a woman and the first libretto written in the United States about an American setting. The motif of Indian death songs and the dying away of indigenous Americans captivated others in the burgeoning imaginary of Romanticism. American poet Sarah Wentworth Morton wrote some verse entitled Death Song into the third canto of her Owabi, or The Virtues of Nature, an Indian Tale, of 1790. Hans Graham, a Danish composer who settled in Boston during the 1780s, set Morton's verse for a singer with a small orchestra. According to an archivist's inscription on one of the surviving copies, this was the first orchestration published in the US. 2 points bear repetition at this juncture. What has been acknowledged as the first orchestral score produced in the United States and the first major libretto written by an American woman shared a romanticized portrayal of indigenous American death as central features. What does it mean for both these American musical firsts to thematize the dying away of indigenous peoples? The libretto of Anne Julia Hatton's Tammany and Hans Graham's orchestral death song are literal examples of American musical cultures being founded atop legacies of the lethality of New World conquest and presumptions of settlers replacing indigenous people. In constructing an image of inherently stoic, never-complaining Indians, the death song trope solidified an imaginary that framed native peoples as apt by disposition for yielding to, even welcoming, the colonial dispossession of their lands and ways of living. Métis literary scholar Warren Carreau notes that the backhanded representations of Indians as, quote, autonomous, thoughtful, even virtuous, end quote, accompanied, quote, a counter-discourse that also clings to many of these representations, the specter of indigenous extinction, end quote. Historian Philip J. Deloria argues that settlers adduced a rapid vanishing of quote-unquote authentic Indians following European settlement and sought ultimately to appropriate virtuous traits and capacities they ascribed to idealized figmentive Indians into their constructions of themselves. Having situated themselves as the inheritors of these traits, settlers then figured actual Indians as violent, wild savages who were incapable of preserving their own societies and were destined to die out. This, in some ways, is the original version of the internet meme of Schrodinger's immigrant, who, according to the meme, is simultaneously stealing your job and too lazy to work. The image, which exposes and mocks the contradictions of right-wing national racial hygiene sentiments, combines both hypercapacity for capitalist wage labor and debility, figured in the image as alcoholism, which is meant to imply laziness. Both debility and capacity are pathologized in the national racial hygiene logics that the meme ridicules. Similarly, in the figure of the dying Indian, capacity and debility commingle. Indians were constructed as the original embodiments of capacities that settlers saw as worthy of appropriating for their construction of a new national American identity. Capacities such as stoic bravery, but also freedom and connection with nature and territory. And Indians were constructed in terms of having lapsed into a society-level debility consisting in the incapacity to embody ableist temporalities of longevity and reproductive futurity, the incapacity to maintain their quote-unquote authentic cultures in the face of colonization. So, simultaneously too noble to belong to anything but a mythic hemispheric past, yet too savage, too deficient to perdure in settler time as anything other than the lapsed foil for settler identity and territorial claims. Both sides of the capacity-debility axis in these mythotropes bend towards serving as justificatory mechanisms for settlement and expansion. In summary, the Indian death song trope participates in a paradoxical construction of indigenous peoples that would situate them at a crossing of capacity and debility that reinforce the linkage of livingness and capacity, as well as the linkage of dyingness and debility. The Indian death song trope was something of a musical meme, framing Indians as an archetype for authentic living and flourishing within the New World, yet also as the figure of debility and unfitness for historical ongoingness due to both the arrival of colonizers and what colonizers saw as their proclivities as a people. The coloniality of power here, the power that depends on producing hierarchies, produced an ableist axis of capacity and debility that worked to propound settler normativity and unmarkedness in what can only be regarded as a proto-eugenic imaginary that framed indigenous peoples as inviting and necessitating their own privation. Thank you.